The woman at my wedding dress fitting asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to marry him. The seamstress knelt at my feet with a mouthful of pins, adjusting the hem of my ivory Vera Wang gown, while I stood on the pedestal in front of 3 mirrors. My mother sat in the corner scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to offer opinions about the neckline or the train length. The boutique smelled like lavender and new fabric, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. Everything was perfect except for the woman standing near the dressing room door who'd been watching me for the past 20 minutes with an expression I couldn't quite read. She wasn't staff, based on her street clothes and the way she held herself apart from the other employees. When the seamstress excused herself to get different thread, the woman approached the platform and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Are you absolutely sure you want to marry him?" Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. My mother looked up from her phone with an annoyed expression, ready to defend me from some wedding industry scam. Before she could speak, the woman pulled a business card from her jacket pocket and pressed it into my hand. "My name is Veronica Chan and I'm a forensic accountant. Your fiancé hired me 6 months ago to help him hide assets from someone, and I think that someone might be you." The card felt heavy in my palm like it was made of lead instead of paper. My mother stood up and her voice came out sharp. "Who the hell are you, and what gives you the right to harass my daughter during her fitting?" Veronica didn't break eye contact with me. "I'm trying to prevent you from making the worst mistake of your life. Your fiancé, David Kessler, came to my firm asking how to restructure his finances to make it appear he has significantly less money than he actually does. He specifically mentioned getting married soon and wanting to protect certain assets." The seamstress returned with her thread and stopped short when she sensed the tension in the room. My mother was already moving toward Veronica with her hand raised like she might actually slap this stranger. I stepped down from the pedestal carefully, gathering the dress fabric so I wouldn't trip, and positioned myself between them. "What exactly did David hire you to do?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Veronica pulled out her phone and showed me a document that looked like a financial statement. He wanted me to help him transfer ownership of his 3 rental properties to a shell company registered in Delaware. He has approximately $1.2 million in liquid assets that he's systematically moving into offshore accounts. He told me he was getting married in 4 months and needed everything hidden before the wedding. The numbers on the screen swam in my vision. David had told me he owned 1 rental property that barely broke even. He'd said his savings were around $50,000 and we'd need to be careful about wedding expenses. We'd fought about the cost of this dress, which was $4,000 that I'd paid for myself because he'd said we couldn't afford it. My mother grabbed the phone from Veronica's hand and scrolled through the document with her lawyer instincts activated. This could be forged or taken out of context. You could be a disgruntled ex-girlfriend trying to sabotage their relationship. Veronica retrieved her phone calmly. "I have no personal connection to David Kessler. I'm violating client confidentiality by being here, which could cost me my license and my career. But I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've seen what happens to people who marry someone actively hiding assets. It never ends well, and the person being deceived always pays the highest price." The boutique owner appeared from the back office, clearly alerted by the raised voices. "Is there a problem here? Can I help with something?" Veronica handed her a different business card. "I'm leaving now, but if your client wants to verify anything I've said, my office number is on that card." She looked at me one more time with something like pity in her eyes. "I'm sorry to ruin what should be a happy day, but I couldn't stand by and watch you walk into this blind." She left through the front door and I stood frozen on the platform in my wedding dress, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me. The seamstress awkwardly suggested we continue with the fitting, but my mother was already calling her assistant to run a background check on Veronica Chan. I changed back into my street clothes in the dressing room and caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed naive and foolish. How had I not known? How had I not asked more questions? David and I had been together for 3 years and engaged for 8 months. We'd met at a charity fundraiser where he'd been charming and attentive, making me laugh with stories about his work in commercial real estate development. He'd pursued me relentlessly for weeks until I finally agreed to a proper date. The relationship had moved quickly, but felt right. Or at least I'd convinced myself it felt right. Looking back now with Veronica's words echoing in my head, I saw red flags I'd rationalized away. The way David always paid for dinners in cash, how he'd discouraged me from meeting his business partners, his vague explanations about his work schedule and finances. I'd attributed it to privacy and professional boundaries rather than deliberate deception. My mother drove us home in tense silence. When we pulled into my driveway, she finally spoke. "We need to investigate this before you confront David. If she's telling the truth, we need documentation and legal strategy. If she's lying, we need proof of that too. I can have my firm dig into David's finances by tomorrow morning." The smart move was to wait and gather evidence, but rage was building in my chest and I couldn't stand the thought of pretending everything was normal. I called David and told him we needed to talk immediately. He said he was at a client meeting but could come over in an hour. That hour felt like the longest 60 minutes of my life. I pulled out every document related to our relationship. The apartment lease we'd signed together 6 months ago. The joint credit card he'd suggested we open for wedding expenses. The prenuptial agreement his lawyer had drafted that I'd thought was standard protection, but now seemed more sinister. My mother sat at my kitchen table with her laptop running searches on David's business entities. She found the Delaware shell company Veronica had mentioned, registered 3 weeks after David proposed to me. The ownership structure was deliberately complex, designed to obscure the true owner's identity. But my mother was a corporate attorney who specialized in untangling exactly these kinds of structures, and she'd taught me enough to recognize the patterns. When David arrived, he kissed me like nothing was wrong and asked why I'd sounded upset on the phone. I handed him Veronica's business card and watched his face carefully. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, his expression flickered with something that looked like panic. Then his features rearranged themselves into confused concern. Who is this? Why did someone give you a forensic accountant's card? He was good at lying. His voice had exactly the right tone of bewilderment. But I'd seen that initial reaction, and now I couldn't unsee it. A woman approached me at my dress fitting today and told me you hired her to hide your assets before our wedding. She showed me financial documents with your name on them. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's insane. I've never heard of this person. Someone is clearly trying to sabotage us. Did you get her full name? I can have my lawyer send a cease and desist. My mother emerged from the kitchen holding printouts of her research. Veronica Chan is a licensed forensic accountant with an impeccable reputation. She has no connection to anyone in our social circle and no apparent motive to lie. What she does have is documentation of shell companies and offshore accounts tied to your name. David looked between us, and I saw the moment he realized the game was over. His shoulders dropped slightly, and he sat down heavily on my couch. Can we discuss this privately without your mother here? My mother laughed without humor. Absolutely not. I'm her legal counsel in this matter, and any conversation about hidden assets and fraudulent financial disclosure happens with me present. David ran his hands through his hair, and I noticed for the first time how calculated even that gesture seemed. Everything about him was performance. Okay, fine. Yes, I hired Veronica Chan to help me restructure some assets. But it's not what you think. I have creditors from a previous business venture that failed. I'm protecting money that's rightfully mine from people who want to take it in frivolous lawsuits. I never lied to you about anything important. My mother pulled up more documents on her laptop. These aren't creditor protections. These are asset concealment strategies specifically designed to hide wealth from a spouse in the event of divorce. The timing corresponds exactly with your engagement. This is textbook financial fraud. David stood up and his voice rose in volume. You're twisting everything to make me look bad. I was protecting our future together from people who would try to take advantage of us. I was going to tell you about the properties and the savings once we were married and had proper legal protections in place. The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. I moved to the door and opened it. Get out of my apartment. I'm calling off the wedding and I never want to see you again. David's expression transformed from defensive to angry in an instant. You're making a huge mistake. I've invested 3 years in this relationship. I've paid for vacations and dinners and gifts. You owe me the chance to explain properly. My mother positioned herself between David and me. She owes you nothing. You committed fraud by misrepresenting your financial situation. Leave now or I'm calling the police. David grabbed his jacket and walked to the door, but stopped in the doorway to deliver one final threat. You'll regret this. I have lawyers who will tie you up in litigation for years if you try to claim any emotional damages or waste of time. Everything between us was legal and you can't prove otherwise. He left, and I locked the door behind him, then immediately started shaking. My mother pulled me into a hug, and I realized I was crying. Not because I'd lost David, but because I'd almost married someone capable of such calculated deception. The next morning, my mother's firm delivered a comprehensive report on David's finances. The truth was worse than Veronica had indicated. David had 4 rental properties worth collectively over $2 million, not one struggling building. He had investment accounts totaling $1.7 million that he'd never mentioned. He'd been systematically underreporting his income to me while living off cash from his rental income. The prenuptial agreement he'd proposed would have left me with nothing in a divorce while protecting all his hidden assets. His entire courtship had been a financial con. My mother filed complaints with the state bar and financial regulatory agencies about David's fraudulent activities. She also contacted Veronica Chan to thank her for the risky intervention. Veronica agreed to meet with us at her office downtown. Her workspace was modest but professional, filled with filing cabinets and multiple computer monitors. She offered us coffee and we sat in chairs across from her desk. I need you to understand what made me violate client confidentiality, Veronica began. David came to my office 6 months ago with a very specific request. He wanted to hide assets from his future wife in a way that would survive forensic accounting scrutiny in a divorce. He literally said those words, in a divorce, before you were even married. She pulled up files on her computer and showed us the email chain with David. His messages were cold and calculating. discussing you like you were an adversary to be managed rather than a partner he loved. He asked about strategies to make it appear he had gambling debts or business losses to explain away missing money. When I refused to help him commit what I considered fraud, he threatened to sue me for breach of contract. I felt sick reading David's words. He'd planned the entire relationship as a financial transaction. Veronica continued her story. I couldn't legally warn you while David was technically still a client, and I was bound by confidentiality. But 2 weeks ago, he terminated our contract because I wouldn't provide the services he wanted. That freed me ethically to speak up. I'd been tracking your wedding plans through social media, waiting for an opportunity to reach you privately. I stood up and hugged this woman who'd risked her career to save me. Veronica seemed surprised by the gesture, but returned it awkwardly. I see a lot of financial abuse in my work, she said quietly. Wealth concealment, hidden accounts, fraudulent disclosure. It destroys people's lives. I couldn't let it happen to you when I had the power to prevent it. My mother asked the question I'd been afraid to voice. Do you think David has done this before? Has he targeted other women? Veronica's expression darkened. I can't prove anything, but yes. I believe this is a pattern. He's too practiced at it, too specific in his strategies. After I warned you, I did some digging into his history. He was engaged twice before you. Both engagements ended abruptly right before the wedding. I couldn't find any public records of why, but the timing suggests something went wrong at the last minute both times. The implications settled over me like ice water. David was a serial con artist who targeted women for financial gain. He'd probably done this multiple times, getting close to marriage before something exposed him or he got cold feet. I was just the latest mark in a long-running scheme. My mother immediately started making calls to her investigative contacts. Within a week, she'd tracked down one of David's previous fiancées, a woman named Allison Burke who lived in Boston. Allison agreed to speak with me by video call. Her story was eerily similar to mine. David had swept her off her feet with charm and romance. He'd claimed to have modest means and pushed for a prenuptial agreement that heavily favored him. 2 weeks before their wedding, Allison's brother, who worked in finance, had run a background check and discovered hidden assets. When confronted, David had become hostile and threatening, exactly as he'd done with me. The wedding was called off, and David had sued Allison for breach of contract and emotional damages. The lawsuit went nowhere, but it had cost her thousands in legal fees and emotional trauma. I'm so sorry you went through this, Allison said through the screen. David is a predator who uses relationships as business transactions. I've tried to warn people about him, but he's careful to keep a clean public image. After we spoke, I felt compelled to find the other ex-fiancé. My mother's investigators located her in Portland. Her name was Whitney Cross, and she was initially reluctant to talk. When I explained what had happened to me and mentioned Allison, she finally agreed to a phone conversation. Whitney's experience had been the worst of the three. She'd actually married David before discovering the hidden assets. He'd filed for divorce 4 months into the marriage, claiming irreconcilable differences. The prenuptial agreement had left her with nothing despite having given up her job and moved across the country for him. She'd spent 2 years in litigation trying to prove fraud, but David's lawyers had buried her in motions and delays until she ran out of money to fight. He destroyed my life, Whitney said, her voice breaking. I lost my career, my savings, my reputation. He made me look like a gold digger who'd married him for money when the opposite was true. I had more money than he claimed to have. That's why he targeted me. The pattern became clear. David sought out successful women with their own assets. He presented himself as modestly successful, encouraging them to pay for things and contribute financially to the relationship. Then he'd push for prenuptial agreements that protected his hidden wealth while leaving them vulnerable. If the relationship made it to marriage, he'd file for divorce and walk away with everything while his ex-wife was left emotionally and financially devastated. My mother compiled all our evidence and filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. The case was assigned to a prosecutor named Lawrence Vega, who specialized in financial crimes. We met with him at his office, and he reviewed everything with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen thousands of scam artists. This is sophisticated enough to potentially constitute wire fraud and conspiracy, Vega explained. The interstate nature of his shell companies and the pattern of targeting multiple victims gives us federal jurisdiction if we need it. I'm going to open a formal investigation. The investigation took 4 months. Vega's team uncovered 5 additional women David had scammed over a 15-year period. Some had dated him briefly before he moved on. Others had been engaged or married. The financial damage totaled over $3 million in legal fees, lost wages, and emotional distress. David had been running this con for over a decade, refining his approach with each victim. The criminal charges were filed on a Wednesday morning. David was arrested at one of his rental properties while collecting rent from a tenant. The news coverage was extensive because the case had elements that captured public attention. Wealthy real estate developer arrested for multi-million-dollar romance fraud scheme. David's lawyers immediately held a press conference declaring his innocence and describing the charges as a vindictive attack by bitter ex-girlfriends. But Vega had built an airtight case. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. David had created false financial statements for each relationship, systematically underreporting his net worth by millions. He'd used the same Delaware shell company for multiple schemes. His email correspondence showed deliberate planning and intent to defraud. The prenuptial agreements were nearly identical across all relationships, written by the same attorney who was now under investigation himself. The preliminary hearing was held 2 months after the arrest. All of David's victims were there, sitting together in a row that felt like solidarity and shared trauma. David's attorney tried to argue that asset protection was legal and that David's relationships had simply failed for normal reasons. The judge wasn't buying it. The pattern of behavior, the false financial disclosures, and the systematic targeting of successful women demonstrated clear criminal intent. David was held without bail pending trial. The trial itself was scheduled for 6 months later. Vega's team used that time to build their case while David's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to suppress evidence and discredit the victims. They attacked Veronica Chan's decision to violate client confidentiality, arguing everything she'd revealed should be excluded. The judge ruled that Veronica had acted appropriately once the client relationship ended and that her testimony was admissible. They tried to exclude testimony from David's previous victims, claiming it was prejudicial character evidence. The judge allowed it under the pattern and practice exception, ruling that multiple similar acts showed deliberate methodology rather than coincidence. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed with media and supporters. Vega's opening statement laid out David's 15-year scheme in devastating detail. David Kessler is not a romantic partner who happened to be financially savvy. He is a con artist who used romance as a cover for systematic financial fraud. He targeted successful women, gained their trust, convinced them to contribute financially to relationships while hiding his own substantial wealth, then either abandoned them before marriage or divorced them shortly after, walking away with his hidden assets intact while his victims were left with nothing. The defense attorney, a polished man named Gregory Dunn, argued that David was simply a private person who kept his finances separate and that his relationships had ended for normal reasons unrelated to money. He painted David as a victim of gold diggers who were now coordinating to destroy him because he'd rejected them. The prosecution called Veronica Chan first. She testified about David's specific requests to hide assets from his future wife and his explicit mention of protecting money in the event of divorce before even being married. She provided email evidence and contemporaneous notes from their meetings. The defense's cross-examination tried to make her look like a disgruntled service provider who'd been fired and sought revenge. Veronica remained calm and professional, explaining that she'd only come forward after the client relationship ended, and only because she believed a crime was being planned. Each of David's victims testified about their experiences. Allison described how David had love-bombed her with attention and gifts early in the relationship, then gradually became controlling about finances while hiding his own wealth. Whitney broke down while describing the aftermath of her divorce and the years of litigation that had bankrupted her emotionally and financially. 2 other women testified about shorter relationships where David had borrowed money from them that was never repaid, always with elaborate stories about temporary cash flow problems despite having millions in hidden accounts. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of all the women he'd hurt. Vega asked me to describe the relationship from the beginning. I talked about David's charm and attentiveness, how he'd made me feel special and chosen, how he'd presented himself as modestly successful and frugal. Then I described learning the truth from Veronica and the horror of realizing I'd been targeted as a mark rather than loved as a partner. The defense's cross-examination was brutal. Dunn suggested I was embarrassed about being dumped and had fabricated evidence to get revenge. He implied I'd coordinated with other women to create false testimony. He questioned why I'd never asked more questions about David's finances if I was truly suspicious. I answered each question honestly, acknowledging that yes, I should have asked more questions. Yes, I'd been naive and trusting. But that didn't excuse David's deliberate lies and systematic fraud. The financial evidence was presented through expert testimony. A forensic accountant walked the jury through David's various shell companies and offshore accounts. A real estate expert testified about the value of David's hidden properties. An attorney explained how the prenuptial agreements had been specifically designed to protect hidden assets while leaving the women vulnerable. David's own lawyer, who drafted the prenuptial agreements, was called as a witness after being granted immunity. He testified that David had explicitly told him about hidden assets and asked for agreements that would protect that wealth in divorce while making it appear David had little money. The lawyer admitted he should have refused the work and reported David's fraudulent intent. David testified in his own defense, which Vega later told me was a strategic error. On the stand, David claimed he'd been protecting generational wealth from gold diggers. He said he'd loved all the women but couldn't trust them with knowledge of his finances. He described his asset protection as prudent business practice. Under Vega's cross-examination, David's story fell apart. Vega showed email after email where David had explicitly discussed hiding assets from future wives and protecting money for divorce. He confronted David with financial statements that showed radically different net worth figures provided to different women. He walked David through the timeline of his relationships, showing how each followed the exact same pattern. When asked why he'd never disclosed his true financial situation to any of these women before marriage, David had no good answer. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the 4 women read guilty verdicts on all counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of making false statements. David's face remained blank as the verdicts were read, but I saw his hands grip the defense table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge had reviewed all the victim impact statements and the sentencing recommendations. She addressed David directly before announcing the sentence. "Mr. Kessler, you conducted a 15-year campaign of emotional and financial abuse against women who trusted you. You used romance as a weapon and relationships as crime scenes. You showed no remorse and attempted to blame your victims for your own calculated cruelty." The sentence was 12 years in federal prison followed by 5 years supervised release. David would also be required to pay full restitution to all victims, which the court calculated at over $4 million, including legal fees, lost wages, and emotional damages. David's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, but legal experts said it was unlikely to succeed given the overwhelming evidence. After sentencing, all of David's victims met for dinner at a restaurant downtown. We'd bonded through the investigation and trial, forming a support group of sorts. Sitting around the table, we talked about what we'd lost and what we'd gained. Whitney had started a nonprofit organization helping other victims of romance fraud. Allison had written a book about her experience that was being published the following spring. The other women had gone back to their careers and lives, stronger for having survived and fought back. I'd returned to my job in marketing and started dating again, though cautiously. The experience with David had taught me to trust my instincts and ask hard questions early in relationships. I'd also become active in advocacy, speaking at conferences about financial abuse and the warning signs of romance fraud. Veronica Chan joined us for dinner and we toasted her courage in coming forward. She'd faced disciplinary review from her professional organization for the confidentiality violation, but the board had ultimately sided with her decision. She'd become something of a folk hero in forensic accounting circles for prioritizing ethics over legal technicalities. The media coverage of David's conviction sparked broader conversations about romance fraud and asset concealment. Several states passed laws requiring fuller financial disclosure before marriage and limiting the use of prenuptial agreements to hide assets. The case became required reading in law schools and business ethics courses as an example of how seemingly legal tools could be weaponized for abuse. 6 months after David's conviction, I received an email from a woman in Chicago who'd been engaged to a man exhibiting similar patterns to David. She'd seen news coverage of the trial and recognized the warning signs. After investigating her fiancé's finances with help from a forensic accountant, she discovered he'd hidden over $800,000 and had been married 3 times before, each marriage ending abruptly after prenuptial agreements were signed. She'd confronted him, called off the wedding, and reported him to authorities. Her email thanked me for speaking publicly about my experience and said it had literally saved her life. I forwarded the email to the other women, and we discussed creating a formal resource database for people who suspected they were being targeted by romance fraudsters. With Veronica's help, we built a website that outlined warning signs, provided checklists for financial due diligence, and connected victims with vetted forensic accountants and lawyers. The site went viral within months, receiving thousands of visitors and dozens of emails from people seeking help. A year after David's sentencing, I was asked to testify before a congressional committee examining financial fraud in personal relationships. I sat at a table facing rows of legislators and described my experience. I explained how David had weaponized trust and intimacy to commit fraud. I outlined the gaps in financial disclosure laws that predators exploited. I recommended stronger protections for victims and clearer criminal penalties for romance-based financial crimes. The committee members listened intently, and several indicated they'd draft legislation based on the testimony. 2 years after David's conviction, I stood in the same bridal boutique where Veronica had warned me. This time, I was there with my friend Kelsey, who was getting married. The seamstress knelt at Kelsey's feet, adjusting her hem while I sat in the corner where my mother had been that day. Kelsey looked radiant and happy, excited about her upcoming marriage to a man who'd been transparent and honest from their first date. Watching Kelsey on the platform in her wedding dress, I thought about how differently my life had turned out because one woman had the courage to speak up. Veronica Chan had risked everything to warn a stranger, and that warning had saved not just me, but dozens of other women. The ripple effects of her decision continued expanding, creating awareness and change that would protect people for years to come. My own second chance at love had come quietly when I'd least expected it. His name was Thomas, and he was a teacher who'd been through his own difficult divorce. We'd met at a friend's party and bonded over shared experiences with betrayal and the hard work of learning to trust again. He'd shown me his finances on our third date, unprompted, and we'd laughed about the awkwardness of it. But it mattered. Transparency mattered. Thomas and I got engaged a year after we started dating. There was no drama, no hidden accounts, no shell companies, just two people who'd been hurt before choosing to build something honest together. We married in a small ceremony with close friends and family, including all the women from David's trial and Veronica Chan, who'd become one of my closest friends. Standing at the altar across from Thomas, I thought about the woman I'd been in that bridal boutique 3 years earlier. She'd been naive and trusting, ready to marry someone she barely knew. The woman I'd become was wiser but not cynical, stronger but not hardened. I'd learned that trust had to be earned and that love without honesty was just performance. David served his 12-year sentence, and I never thought about him except when helping other victims avoid similar fates. The life he'd tried to steal from me had been replaced with something better built on truth rather than lies. And somewhere in Chicago or Portland or Boston, a woman was standing in her wedding dress asking the right questions because someone had cared enough to warn me.